Hey, you missed a spot, maybe try cleaning like your daddy. That's what Principal Halbert sneered in front of half the school as Jamal Reed walked past. A 16-year-old black boy. Quiet. Brilliant. And, apparently, invisible. What she didn't know was what Jamal had tucked inside his backpack, a sealed letter from NASA, awarding him a National Engineering Fellowship. For years, he'd been mocked, ignored, and labeled the janitor's son. But this time, Jamal decided not to stay silent. This is the story of how one student turned humiliation into history. And how a single sheet of paper exposed years of bias and changed an entire school. Before we begin, if stories of justice and quiet defiance speak to you, hit that subscribe button. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Let's dive in. The first time it happened, no one really noticed. It was during morning announcements at Westbridge High, a quiet public school in suburban Ohio. Students were still sleepily arriving, clutching their coffees and backpacks. Over the PA system, Principal Joan Halbert's voice rang out like clockwork, listing club meetings, today's lunch, and a reminder to clear out locker decorations before break. Then, in a seemingly offhand tone, she added, "And a special note to students like Jamal, or is it Jerome, please remember we're a school, not your family's workplace." The hallway fell briefly silent. Jamal Reed paused mid-step, holding the handle of his locker. His breath caught, just for a moment, before he forced a small, practiced smile and turned the combination knob. He knew exactly who she meant. Jamal was used to being invisible. He was polite, punctual, and brilliant, but he rarely spoke unless called on. His father worked as a custodian at Westbridge and had done so for nearly 18 years. Most students didn't know. Some teachers barely remembered. But Principal Halbert always remembered. It wasn't the first jab she'd thrown his way. Last semester, when Jamal aced the midterm with a perfect score, she had commented in front of the faculty lounge, "It's amazing what some kids can pick up while tagging along during their dad's night shifts." That morning, however, something inside Jamal shifted. Later in homeroom, when his teacher handed back graded projects, Jamal stared at his A+ and barely felt anything. It wasn't pride or satisfaction. It was frustration. A boiling, silent kind of rage. Not the loud kind, but the heavy, enduring kind that sits behind your ribs and waits. When the final bell rang, he walked the long way to his locker, passing Principal Halbert near the science wing. She stood talking to a district visitor in a suit. As Jamal approached, she lowered her voice and gave him a brief, fake smile. Then she whispered, just loud enough. "Careful not to smudge the floors your daddy polished." Jamal stopped. His heart pounded. He looked at her, at the smug way her eyes avoided his directly, the way her words always danced between insult and deniability. He could have said something then. He could have walked away. Instead, he opened his locker, reached deep behind his calculus textbook, and pulled out a sealed envelope. On the front, NASA Youth Aerospace Fellowship, acceptance packet. He had kept it hidden for weeks. His plan had been to surprise his dad first, maybe frame it on the kitchen wall. But something told him this moment needed the truth. Jamal turned, slowly, letter in hand. "Actually, ma'am," he said, voice steady but cold, "my father didn't help with this." She blinked. "Excuse me." He stepped forward and held out the envelope. "This is mine. I was accepted into a NASA youth program. Top 0.1% in the country." There was a pause. The district visitor turned to stare at him, intrigued. Principal Halbert's face froze, not in anger, but in something that looked like fear dressed in confusion. "I thought you should know," Jamal added, and walked away without waiting for a response. In the hallway, a few students had noticed. One of them whispered, "Was that NASA?" Another quietly pulled out a phone. Jamal didn't care. That night, he sat with his dad at their kitchen table, the acceptance letter spread between them. His father's hands trembled as he read the details, eyes glistening behind thick glasses. He reached across the table and said, "They'll never see you the same again, son." Jamal looked back and said, "Good. I'm tired of being who they think I am." The next morning, things would begin to change, but not because of Jamal's anger. Because he had shown the truth. And the truth had power. Jamal arrived at school the next day 30 minutes early. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to be seen. Normally, he would slip quietly into the science lab or the library. But that morning, he walked through the front entrance with his NASA folder tucked neatly into his backpack. He wasn't flaunting it, but he wasn't hiding it either. And in a school like Westbridge, where perception often outweighed truth, visibility was its own quiet rebellion. As he walked down the hallway, students began to whisper. A blurry video had made its way to Snapchat overnight. In it, Jamal could be seen handing something to the principal, a letter, and walking away. The caption? "Custodian's kid flexed on Halberd." Most people didn't believe it. Until they saw him now. He passed a cluster of students near the lockers. One of them nudged the other and whispered, "That's him." A girl in a varsity jacket glanced up from her phone and said, "Yo, is it true? You got into NASA or something?" Jamal smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said simply. "I did." By the time he reached first period, the entire front row of desks had turned to face him instead of the board. Even his chemistry teacher, Mr. Sullivan, paused before starting class. "I saw your name in a NASA release this morning," the teacher said, tone part surprise, part admiration. "That's impressive, Jamal. Congratulations." "Thanks," Jamal replied. "I was going to tell you, eventually." Sullivan smiled and turned back to the whiteboard. But Jamal could feel the shift. The silence he'd lived in for years had broken. During lunch, he was called to the front office. When he walked in, Principal Halberd stood behind her desk, stiff posture, arms crossed. Her lips were tight, and a folder rested on her desk. Across from her sat the district superintendent, Dr. Renee Abrams, a calm, sharp-eyed black woman in a navy blue suit. She looked up and gestured to the chair. "Jamal. Please, sit." Jamal sat slowly, keeping his hands on his lap. "I asked you here because some questions have come up," Dr. Abrams began. "About an incident yesterday, and about your file." Halberd's eyes darted toward the superintendent, then back to Jamal. Abrams continued. "According to our system, there's no record of your application to the NASA program. But this morning I received a forwarded email from their outreach coordinator. Not only did you get in, you scored in the 99.8th percentile." Halberd remained silent. "We'd like to know," Dr. Abrams said gently, "why no one in this school was aware of your nomination. There was no counselor referral. No staff support." Jamal looked down for a moment. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out the folder, the same one from yesterday, and placed it carefully on the desk. "I didn't want anyone here to ruin it," he said quietly. Abrams nodded slowly. Halberd's lips parted slightly, as if to object, but no words came out. Jamal turned his gaze toward her. "I've been told for years that I'm just the janitor's son. That I don't belong in advanced classes. That I must have guessed right when I aced tests. So I stopped telling people what I was working on." The room fell into silence. Abrams finally spoke. "That's going to change." She stood, took the folder in her hands, and said, "Jamal, I'll be personally forwarding this to the district's gifted student program. You deserve mentorship, and resources, real ones. And as for the school's failure to recognize that," she glanced at Halberd, "we'll be investigating that separately." As Jamal stood up, she extended a hand. "You've done more than prove your intelligence," she said. "You've exposed a problem that needs fixing." Jamal shook her hand, nodded once at Halberd, who could no longer meet his eyes, and walked out of the office. In the hallway, students watched as he passed. But this time, there was no whispering. There was quiet respect. And something else. Anticipation. Because for the first time, Jamal wasn't just the custodian's son. He was the kid with the NASA file. And Westbridge High wasn't ready for what came next. By the following week, Jamal Reed was no longer just a name on the attendance sheet. His story had made it out of Westbridge High and into the local news. At first, it was a brief write-up on a student accepted into a NASA fellowship, but as more details emerged, the principal's comment, the silence in his records, the suppressed nomination, the tone shifted. The headline on Channel 9 News read, "Ohio teen accepted to NASA program, school failed to notify district." Then came the interview requests. Emails from journalists. Messages from STEM organizations. And finally, an official call from NASA's Youth Engagement Office asking if Jamal would be willing to speak at their upcoming Innovation Summit in Houston. "Wait," he said, holding the phone to his ear in disbelief. "You want me to speak?" "Yes," the woman on the other end replied warmly. "Your story has inspired a lot of people in the space community. We'd be honored to hear it in your words." He stared at the floor of his bedroom, the same room where he used to sketch rocket designs on his math homework. I'd be honored." The next day, Principal Halbert attempted damage control. Over the intercom, her voice was unusually warm. "Students, please join me in congratulating Jamal Reed for his outstanding academic achievement. We are proud of his selection by NASA and look forward to his continued success." Some students rolled their eyes. Others whispered, "Now she wants to act proud." Jamal didn't flinch. He had learned that empty praise was often more dangerous than insults. It tried to rewrite history without acknowledging the wound. At lunch, he sat quietly reading an email from a retired black aerospace engineer who wrote, "They told me in 1979 that black boys didn't belong in space. I just want to tell you, I see you. And I'm proud." He didn't show it to anyone. But he reread it 3 times. Later that afternoon, a camera crew from Channel 9 showed up outside the school. They asked for an interview with Jamal. At first, he hesitated. But then he saw the crowd gathering, teachers, classmates, even some janitorial staff who had known his father for years. He stepped in front of the mic. "I didn't plan to be noticed," he said. "I just wanted to learn. I've spent most of my life being careful not to stand out, because I thought that would make things easier. But I realize now, staying quiet only protected people who wanted me small." The crowd murmured. A few nodded. "My father taught me that dignity isn't about silence. It's about standing up when the world wants you to sit down." From the edge of the crowd, his dad stood in his custodial uniform, arms crossed, eyes full of pride. The reporter asked, "What would you say to other students like you, those who feel unseen?" Jamal looked straight into the camera. "Keep building. Keep dreaming. Whether they believe in you or not, the universe is still waiting." By evening, the clip had gone viral. NASA's official social media shared the moment with the caption, "We see you, Jamal." Students at Westbridge began to post messages of support. Some teachers offered apologies. Others remained quiet, uncomfortable now in their silence. And Principal Halbert? She was called into a closed-door meeting with the superintendent and the school board. No announcement was made yet. But for the first time in years, the staff lounge was quiet when Jamal's name came up. Because he wasn't just the janitor's son anymore. He was the kid who got invited to speak at NASA. And the whole country was listening. 3 days later, Principal Joan Halbert stood behind her desk, staring out the window of her office. Outside, news vans still lined the sidewalk. Students passed by in clusters, some wearing homemade shirts that said, "Jamal Expectations." One even wore a NASA pin, gifted to him by Jamal himself. She turned away from the glass and sat down, slowly, like the chair no longer trusted her weight. A knock at the door. Dr. Renee Abrams entered, a manila folder in her hand and a grim look on her face. "Joan," the superintendent said flatly, "we need to talk." Principal Halbert gestured half-heartedly to the chair opposite her desk. "About what?" Abrams sat, placing the folder between them. "About the report. The one compiled after interviewing 6 students, 2 guidance counselors, and 1 custodian, your employee of 18 years. And yes, about Jamal Reed." Halbert opened her mouth, but Abrams raised a finger. "The report outlines a consistent pattern of behavior: verbal microaggressions, withheld opportunities, passive undermining. Some of your own staff admitted they were afraid to recommend students you didn't favor." "That's subjective," Halbert snapped. "No. That's culture. And the culture you created here has consequences." Halbert leaned back, folding her arms. "So what are you saying?" Abrams didn't flinch. "You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately. The board will meet next Monday to decide on formal action." Halbert's face hardened. "This is political." "No," Abrams said, standing. "This is overdue." Outside the office, word spread quickly. Students watched as Halbert left the building through the back exit, her heels clicking across the tile like a retreat. Some teachers clapped quietly in the staff lounge. Others said nothing, but no one objected. That afternoon, a school-wide assembly was held in the auditorium. Dr. Abrams stepped onto the stage. "Today," she began, "I'm not here to speak about punishment. I'm here to talk about change. And that starts by recognizing what went wrong." She turned toward the wings of the stage. "Jamal. Would you join us?" The auditorium erupted in applause as Jamal walked out, looking both stunned and humbled. He stood at the center of the stage, hands at his sides. "Many of you already know who he is. But what you might not know," Abrams said, "is how many obstacles were placed in his way. And how quietly he pushed through every one of them." Jamal stepped up to the microphone. His voice was calm, even, but full of weight. "I never wanted this to be about revenge," he said. "I just wanted people to see what they weren't looking at." He paused, then added, "There are other kids like me, kids who've been told not to aim too high, or stay quiet and stay safe. This school, this country, can't afford that anymore." Silence. Then a wave of applause, louder this time, more unified. That night, Westbridge High made national news again. This time, not for shame, but for change. Principal Halbert's face was shown beside the headline. "Administrator suspended after NASA scholar's story exposes systemic bias." And Jamal. His photo was right next to it, but his caption read, "Future engineer. Speaker. Change maker." He didn't celebrate. He didn't post. He sat at the dinner table with his dad, eating spaghetti, reviewing his notes for the NASA summit. "You nervous?" his father asked. Jamal looked up and said, "Not anymore. Because once you've made them see you, really see you, there's no going back." The morning of the NASA Youth Innovation Summit, Jamal stood at Gate C-12 of the Cleveland Hopkins International Airport wearing a navy blue blazer and holding a folder thick with his handwritten notes, diagrams, and a photo of him and his dad taped inside the back cover. This time, no one called him the janitor's son. As he boarded the plane to Houston, a flight attendant glanced at his badge and paused. "NASA Youth Delegate?" she asked, eyebrows raised with genuine curiosity. "That's incredible. First one I've ever seen." Jamal gave a shy smile. "Thank you. First one I've ever been." At the summit, Jamal was surrounded by students from around the country, some from prep academies, others from top science programs. There were sons of engineers, daughters of professors, and then, there was him. Yet when he took the stage, something changed. He didn't begin with formulas or code. He began with a story. "I used to believe silence was strength," Jamal told the room of scientists, educators, and industry leaders. "But silence, when forced, is just another form of erasure. I stayed quiet for years, thinking that if I worked hard enough, someone would notice. They didn't. Until I made them." He clicked to the first slide, a drawing he had made in 6th grade of a rocket with the words, "Read Project, 2035 Orbit." People smiled. Some laughed gently. The next slide showed the actual design he'd submitted to NASA, a multi-stage satellite deployment concept optimized for reduced orbital decay. The smiles vanished. Heads tilted forward. Notes were taken. By the time he finished his presentation, the applause was more than polite, it was thunderous. Afterward, a woman in a red blazer approached him. "Dr. Angela Wilcox," she said, extending a hand. "NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory. If you're ever interested in summer research, we'd love to talk." He shook her hand, heart racing. "I'd be honored." News of his speech rippled outward. By the end of the week, Scientific American ran a feature, "How a Janitor's Son Quietly Built a Path to the Stars." But back in Ohio, something even more powerful was happening. Westbridge High's culture began to shift. A new interim principal was named, a young Latino educator named Mr. Vargas, who immediately opened office hours for student input. Posters about STEM opportunities began to appear in hallways. Guidance counselors were instructed to track nominations for every advanced program available. And on the first Monday back from break, a plaque appeared outside the school library. It read, "The Reed Room, in honor of Jamal Reed, NASA Fellow and Student Advocate." Students stood in front of it, taking photos. Some smiled. Others just stared. Jamal didn't say much about it. He was already thinking about his next project, something about propulsion efficiency in low Earth orbit. But on Friday afternoon, as he passed the plaque on his way to meet his dad in the parking lot, he stopped and read it again. Not for validation. Just to remind himself that silence no longer defined him. He had learned to speak, to fight, and to rise. And now? He was just getting started. Some people will only see you for where you come from, until you force them to see where you're going. Jamal Reed's story is not just about brilliance, but about quiet resistance. When your environment tells you to stay in the background, speaking up becomes an act of courage. You don't need to shout to be heard, just let your work speak loud enough. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or overlooked, remember, your worth isn't defined by their expectations. It's defined by your potential. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and what time it is. Because stories like Jamal's deserve to be seen, shared, and remembered.